From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
We have a special guest with us tonight, Sam Weinberg, and I'm going to turn things over to the Director of Education Outreach here at the Library of Congress, Leanne Potter, to welcome you and to introduce our speaker.
Thanks very much, Kathy. As Kathy said, we really are so glad all of you could join us this evening for this, the Library of Congress's first online conference. It is my pleasure to be serving as the MC for this session entitled Reading Like a Historian. During this session, for about the next 50 minutes, we will explore the Stanford History Education Group's Reading Like a Historian curriculum and the research behind this free online resource. You will have an opportunity to examine a sample lesson plan and consider how to implement these materials in your classroom. I'm really pleased to introduce a good friend, Sam Weinberg. Sam is the Margaret Jacks Professor of Education and Professor of History by Courtesy at Stanford University. He leads the Stanford History Education Group, the Teaching with Primary Sources program at Stanford University, Stanford's PhD program in History Education, and the Master's program for future history teachers. His scholarship has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the New Yorker, as well as on NPR and C-SPAN. Delighted to have you here, Sam. Let's get started.
My name is Sam Weinberg, and thank you very much, Leanne, for the introduction, and Kathy for setting this up, and welcome to all of you who are joining in here today. I want to spend the next hour with you or so, with time for questions, talking about the question of historical literacy, what it is and what it is not. And I want to begin, actually, by telling you about a textbook called Our Virginia, which was published and went into classrooms in the state of Virginia in October of 2010. Now, this is a textbook that was intended for fifth graders. And in the story that it tells about the Civil War, it contains this statement. Thousands of Southern blacks fought in the Confederate ranks, including 2 black battalions under the command of Stonewall Jackson. Now, if you know a little bit about your Civil War history, you might be a bit surprised by this claim. If you know about the role, for instance, of African Americans in the Civil War, you might know, if you've seen the movie Glory, the story of the Massachusetts 54th, which was the first black division to join the Union ranks. It was a topic of considerable debate among Union soldiers. By the end of the Civil War, there were about 180,000 African Americans who were suited up for the forces of the Union. But the notion of Southern blacks fighting for the Confederates under Stonewall Jackson, that might be a claim that you're unfamiliar with. Now, if we look at this claim, we know that Thomas Stonewall Jackson actually died on May 10th, 1863. He was killed by friendly fire. So this is still right near the apex of the fighting of the Civil War. The tide has not yet quite turned. And if there are 2 black battalions under Stonewall Jackson, we can imagine that there were many other generals. And if we do our math, well, two battalions, that means a whole bunch of regiments. It means tens of thousands of African Americans who were suited up in uniform under the command of Stonewall Jackson, essentially fighting for the Confederacy. So here's what we do know. We do know, of course, that there were African Americans, slaves often who had no choice, who were brought into the Confederate Army as cooks or as laborers. We even know of cases, and we can find them documented, sometimes with photographic evidence, of slaves who were suited up and accompanied, often under duress, often forced and pressed into service, who accompanied their masters into battle. And so here is a picture of one of the pictures that we have of a case like that. But that's not quite what we're talking about with this claim. We are talking about the historical basis of a claim that there were thousands of African Americans who were armed, who actually fought on behalf of the Confederacy. And we can ask, what exactly were they fighting for? Fighting for the right to remain slaves. It becomes a bit ludicrous. Fighting for the right to have their children go into slavery. The very claim strains the imagination. Now, when we look at the documentary evidence for this claim, when we look in the vast trove of documents that constitutes the documentary record, the only documentary evidence we have of the notion of bringing African Americans and suiting them up and arming them for the Confederacy is General Orders number 14. And you can see from this, in the section that is highlighted in yellow, and you'll also note the date of this particular document, which is March 23rd, 1865. Now, this is in the waning days of the Civil War. It's clear that the South is losing. It's just a matter of time before General Lee decides that he will sign the surrender orders. In fact, this is less than a month away from the signing of those surrender orders on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox. This is the only document that we have of African American soldiers, of the talk of the Confederacy drafting African American soldiers and suiting them up and giving them arms and actually fighting. So the question becomes, in this textbook that was given to children in the state of Virginia, where did the author find the basis for the claim that she makes? When she was asked about it by a reporter for the Washington Post, she responded, "As controversial as it is, I stand by what I write. I am a fairly respected author. I am a fairly respected writer." And this is how the author responded. Now, the Washington Post reporter actually pressed on and tried to find out on what basis did Miss Masoff make these claims that there were organized regiments, that there were that were 50 to 60,000 African American soldiers fighting on behalf of the Civil War. Well, when she was asked how she would document this claim, she said that she reported that she did her research on the internet. And when she was asked where she went to find her information, she pointed reporters to this website, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, which is a patriotic historical educational institution founded in 1896, dedicated to honoring the sacrifices of the Confederate soldier and to preserving Southern culture. This is the situation that we face today. And I am sure that many of you are facing situations where your students come to you and say, well, I Googled it and I found this on the internet. Now, when I grew up, and I'm sure when many of you grew up, before historical information reached us, it had actually been vetted through the hands of subject matter experts and publishers and newspaper editors and the various kinds of people who checked information before it reached our hands. But we are actually living in a time when those kinds of skills of vetting information actually fall on the shoulders of each and every one of us. I don't think that the author of this textbook is altogether different from facing the kinds of dilemmas that we face in a totally new digital Wild West. Now, I want to return to this question of historical literacy because for many people, the notion of historical literacy, at least as it is taught in schools, resembles something like this. Now, this actually is an artifact from a real middle school social studies classroom. I am not going to tell you where. I am going to tell you that it is cut off at 28 items. It actually goes to 50. And the way that this classroom went was that on Monday, the teacher would hand out a list of terms to the middle school students, and on Friday, they would have a quiz on these terms. And I happened to be visiting this classroom to try to understand, what does social studies class look like through the eyes of 7th graders? And so I kind of went up to one table where there were a group of girls working. They were all girls. And I said, well, what are you doing? And they said, we are studying for our Friday quiz. And so I asked them if I could peer at this list that went from Acropolis to Crusades to Czar to diaspora to ethnics and feudalism and to filial piety, etc. And I said to the young girls, I said, well, what exactly is this? And they kind of grumbled and laughed to each other. And then one of the little girls whispered to me and said, sir, it's Traxoline. And I said, excuse me? And she said, sir, it's Traxoline. Now, I wonder how many of you who are listening today would find that answer a little bit quizzical. What
Okay, this is Kat. I'm sorry to
exactly?
interrupt, Sam. I'm sorry to interrupt. We had some audio issues, and now you're back on. So I'm gonna mute myself again. Thank you.
I apologize. What is Traxoline? Well, let me ask you if you can respond to that, because I didn't know. And so, in order for me to essentially test you as really good students of social studies in the eyes of this young girl, I'm going to now teach you a short lesson about Traxoline. So is everyone ready? Okay, pay close attention. It is very important that you learn about Traxoline. Traxoline is a new form of Ziontir. It is monotiled in serostana. Their serostinians crystallate large amounts of fevron and then bracter it to quasyl Traxoline. Traxoline is important because of our Ziontir lessage. Okay, folks, let me ask you this, and you can type your answer. What is Traxoline? I'll wait a second. Indeed, Traxoline is a form of Ziontir. Thank you very much. Now the questions are going to get a little bit harder. Where is Traxoline monotiled? Unbelievable. I'm looking at your answers. You're doing great. Serostana, absolutely correct. However, those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy should be ready for a higher order question, a question that requires some application and some synthesis. And now I'm going to ask you a question about where you're going to have to make a bit of an inference. Why is Traxoline important? I'll wait. Put your thinking caps on. There we go, because of our Ziontir lessage. Now, this was the situation that this young 11-year-old explained to me. This is how she described the kind of the meanings of the words in her social studies class. The words serf and hajj and schism and heretic and plebeian and oligarchy made about as much sense as Traxoline, crystallate Ziontir, and lessage. This notion of disembodied facts that kids can define, unfortunately, in many ways, still defines our ideas about historical literacy. And we need to go no farther than the headlines of our major newspapers when a new study about students' knowledge comes out. This one is actually from May 12th, 2002. Kids get an abysmal grade in history. High school seniors don't know basic facts. And actually, if we were to go nearly 10 years later, we could read virtually the same exact headline. Students stumble again on the basics of history. National test shows little progress. And we will get exactly the same headlines in the 2014 administration of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Over and over again, we talk about the dismal or abysmal knowledge of our students. Yet, if we go back to the first large-scale test of historical facts, which was done in 1917 in Texas, where less than 10% of the population actually made it to high school, we will hear the same kinds of complaints then. But let's change course a little bit. Let's talk about the assumptions behind these kinds of headlines and the assumptions behind the kinds of tests that we give to young people. So what is the assumption? The assumption is that if kids had lots of names and dates, if they were historically literate, if you will, they would be able to think historically. And so I want to talk about this assumption for a second with you by recounting a bit of history that you may or may not be familiar with. So let's go to the dawn of the American Revolution, a very famous event, the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Lexington, April 19th, 1775. Take a look at this picture and think about how you would describe some of the things that you see in it. What is it that you notice? Now, if you compare this painting to another image, I'm seeing some of your answers, lots of smoke, people who are injured, a defiant man. Someone is interpreting the Minuteman in the front with an outstretched arm as saying something. Who knows what he's saying? We don't have a tape recording. Maybe he's saying, our colors don't run. Well, that would be anachronistic since we didn't have colors yet at that point. These men still saw themselves as British subjects. Let me give you another rendition of this same event, a different illustration of it. What do you see in this picture? Now, one of the questions we would want to ask, and I'll read aloud some of the answers that I'm seeing in your chat boxes. The colonists are victims. This is a slaughter. This is not the Battle of Lexington. This is the massacre at Lexington. In fact, if you were to take a magnifying glass to this second illustration, which was actually a woodcut a lithograph done by Amos Doolittle about a month after the actual battle in 1775. If you took a magnifying glass of it, you will see not a single one of the Minutemen actually holding a firearm and taking aim at the British. They are all hastily beating a retreat from the battlefield. Now, how do we know what is true? How would we, here we are, probably one of the shot heard around the world, two different illustrations. We might want to ask, what are the circumstances of each one of these illustrations? I'll go back to the first one for a second. This picture was actually done in 1886 for very different purposes, and this one was done in 1775 for also very different purposes. And yet, when we commemorate ourselves as a people, and we choose an illustration to commemorate this event actually 150 years after the event with the US postage stamp, it is not this one that we choose to put on the postage stamp, but the former. This is the way that we choose as a people to represent ourselves to ourselves. But immediately we are thrown into the abyss of historiography. How do we know what happened in the past? Here are two different perspectives. We can get a variety of original sources that disagree about what happened. Was this a group of colonists standing tall, representing what would become the American spirit? Or were these a group of very scared British subjects getting off of the Lexington Green as soon as they could, as soon as firing started? Now, I wanted to actually look at how some of the successes of our educational system, not the students who do poorly on these factual tests, but students who do quite well, do on them. And so I selected a group of students who had completed an AP history course, had very high reading scores on the SAT, who knew a great deal of history, and I compared them to a group of historians. And I am here to tell you, as a kind of example of what research in education is all about, the chief finding of this research was that the historians did much better on this task, adjudicating among these two different paintings, looking and ferreting out the discrepancies among 7 or 8 fragmented primary sources, many of them which you can find in the Library of Congress's collection. The historians did much better in creating a sound historical interpretation than the high school students. Now, if I could see the facial reaction of many of you, some of you might be scratching your head. You might be saying to yourself, okay, the historians did better. So that's what you want to say, the historians did better. Now, if you are quizzical and you are asking yourself that question, then I would ask you to answer the question, why do you think the historians did better? And you might respond by saying, well, the historians did better because they're historians. After all, they're historians. Well, if you have taken a college philosophy course, Philosophy 101, you know the statement that historians did better because they are historians is what philosophers call a tautology. It's like saying sleeping pills work because of their dormitive properties. It is a case of circular reasoning. You might then say that historians did better because they're better readers. Well, again, I took really the cream of the cream of our high school students. You might say that historians do better because they know more history. That's sort of what defines them. Well, here's what I did. Here's the wrinkle that I threw into this little project. I gave a quiz to historians, questions from the chapter review test at that point of Rise of the American Nation, Todd Curdy. It was the leading U.S. history textbook for the 11th grade when I did this work. And here were some of the kinds of facts that were on this quiz. Virtual representation, olive branch petition, identified George Grenville, internal versus external taxation, the Quebec Act. And I chose only dumb historians. I chose historians who were not specialists in American history, and I chose students who had done very well, in fact, had earned a grade of 3 and above on the AP US history exam, who were in many ways the poster children for the successes of our educational system. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that when the historians and the high school students looked at the original sources that I used, they saw profoundly different things. And I further want to argue that it was not an issue really of a reading level or of knowing different vocabulary. It was the very approach to what a historical text is. And let me see if I can demonstrate that to you by letting you look at one of the primary sources that I used, which you will find in the Library of Congress's collection. So I'm going to make it the next slide and ask you to spend a minute looking at it as a piece of primary evidence about this event. But as you're looking at it, please monitor kind of the way that you read, the way that you approach the document. What's the first thing that you do? What do you attend to? So I'm going to flash it up, and I want you to kind of be bifocal here. Look at the content, but also try to reflect on your own approach to this document. Okay, are we ready? Here it is. Okay, we ready? All right, so I want to kind of model for you how one of these students, very good students, how they approach this document. So I'm going to read a little bit aloud, and I use a technique called thinking aloud, where people articulate their thoughts during the act of reading. So let me try to model how one of the 17-year-olds, we'll call her Ellen, how she approached this document. So she began, 19th. At 2 o'clock, we began our march by wading through a very long ford up to our middle. She stops. She says, a very long ford? I don't know what ford means. Clearly, it's not an automobile. But wading means going through water and up to our middle. So maybe it's a ford is some kind of body of water. For those of you who work with adolescents all day long, and perhaps some of you work with struggling readers or English language learners, you know that kind of metacognition, the ability to step back and infer a word's meaning from context, is an extremely sophisticated skill that characterizes the reading armamentarium of our best students, our best reading comprehenders. She then goes on. After going a few miles, 3 or 4 people were going off to give intelligence, about 5 miles on a town called Lexington, which lay on a road. We heard there were some hundreds of people. She starts, we heard there were some, and she says, it sounds like it was a chaotic situation. She continues to read, I believe 200 to 300. She says, see, yes, it was chaotic. Those of you who are familiar with a reading technique called reciprocal teaching know that at the heart of reciprocal teaching is developing students' metacognition and the use of prediction in the course of reading. So she actually predicts and then confirms what she reads. So again, very, very able reading strategies. She continues to read, gets near the bottom. We then formed on the common, but with some difficulty. And she says, see, I see a chaotic image in our mind. The men were so wild they could hear no orders. Again, a confirmation of the kind of picture that she's developing. We waited a considerable time there and at length proceed on our way to Concord. And then she'll say, entry to April 19th from the diary of Lieutenant John Barker. This is an extremely sophisticated reading with a lot of antiquated vocabulary by a 17-year-old who has the kind of reading skills that we wish for many of our students. She actually went on to a very prestigious 4-year college and had a lot to go on. Now, I want to suggest by showing you the reading of a historian, Fred, a medievalist, who didn't do too good, didn't do too well, excuse my English, on a pretest on the Olive Branch petition and George Grenville. He's a medievalist. We can give him a little slack. He maybe hasn't made his way all the way up to the American Revolution. This medievalist looked at the same document did much worse on the test of factual knowledge that presumably is what you need in order to read critically and to read in sophisticated ways. Let's look at the way that Fred begins his reading. So he begins with the same document. 19th at 2 o'clock, we began our march by wading through a very long ford up to our middles. And this is the first thing that he says. This is the first thing that comes out of his mouth. Diary of John Marker, British, an officer, 19th. That's the day itself. So I want you to think for a second, what is it that Fred has done? What is it that he has done that profoundly distinguishes his reading from the way that these very bright high school students approach this document? I see a lot of answers. You are answering in a lovely way, but I want you to think behaviorally. I want you to really go explain this on the level of what are his eyes doing? What exactly is he doing with his eyes that is so deceptively simple and yet so profoundly different from what the high school students do? So yes, I see someone, he goes to the bottom of the document. So on a pure behavioral level, he goes to the bottom of the document. But how do you explain, what does he mean? That's the day itself. What the heck is he talking about? 19th, that's the day itself. We have to go into these details for you to understand the depth and the sophistication of what appears to be a very simple move. Yes, he knows the date of the battle, and indeed, he's writing it on the same day. Now, I want you to give this document to your students tomorrow without any kind of preparation and see if any single student in the class even makes the suggestion that by putting 19th at the top of a diary entry does not necessarily mean that it was written on the 19th. It could have been written on the 27th. It could have been written on the 28th. It could have been actually after all kinds of hell broke loose and he decided he needed to go back and change his diary. But this is the way the historian starts to think about the nature of historical evidence. Now then he does something that I do not believe that unless you've taught your students this way,
Hello,
it
everyone.
looks like we lost it. Are we back? It looks like we lost.
Yep.
You lost
You're
me.
back.
Am I back?
Yep. You're
I'm
back. Yep.
Okay. So here's what I want you to do tomorrow. Give your students this document and see if any of them do what Fred does here. He continues. He reads the document once through, making a few comments, and then he makes this comment. We all know about diaries. 19th. He wrote it on that day? Maybe. Cover his backside, better that he lost control over his men than to have ordered the first shot. Useful in an inquest. Useful in an inquest. He was a Berkeley historian. What were they smoking in Berkeley? There's nothing in this document about an inquest. There's not. Yet Fred has a fundamentally different relation to historical evidence than our high school students. Our high school students are looking at primary sources almost as if they were baskets of information to be mastered and memorized, to be repeated on a multiple choice test. For Fred, these documents are not inanimate. They are people. And before he can understand what is in a document, he has to know to whom he is speaking. This is why we use primary sources in the classroom. This is why we go to the Library of Congress and examine these sources, because we hear the voices of real human beings who actually made the past. And for kids to resurrect these voices, to actually hear them, is fundamentally different from the kind of socialization that we put them through with 14,000 hours in school, where they look at anything having to do with history as, will I need to know this for the test? Now, I want to end, I'm going to jump through a few slides because our time is short. I want to just quickly talk about, I'm going to skip a bit, and talk about trying out this approach in a large city school district. And about 4 years ago, San Francisco asked us, largely because of issues of literacy and wanting to use and marshal the resources of social studies to help students' literacy. They asked us to come in with this approach and actually take over the 11th grade curriculum in several high schools. And we did what in research terms is called a treatment control study. This was done by my PhD student, Abby Reisman, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And with just indomitable energy, she went into San Francisco and, working with a group of teachers, taught history in this approach, starting with legitimate historical questions, central historical questions, providing some background, the evaluation of evidence, and whole class discussions. Now, I'm going to cut to the chase and show you the kind of thing that very much excited the district. We had different kinds of assessment. The district was very interested in this assessment. We used the Gates-MacGinitie reading comprehension test. And lo and behold, when students in their social studies classrooms are looking carefully at primary source documents and learning to read in a very careful way like this predates the Common Core. We like to say we were common before the Common Core. There is a significant effect for reading level for students in these kinds of classrooms. Since then, we have become, for instance, the social studies curriculum in LA Unified, the second largest district in the country. I can tell you a great deal about this research, but I'm going to now share with you this video. Shows the power of primary sources and inquiry learning.
I remember last year was actually our first year of history, and I did not like it because they would just give us a textbook. When it comes to this year, it was more like, wow, we get documents. Like, I never seen that before, like a teacher give me documents.
The Reading Like a Historian project turns the traditional history classroom on its head. Rather than focusing on the passive retention of names and dates, this approach invites students to become historical investigators, using the skills of historians to answer questions about the past. Each class is organized around a legitimate historical question. Students explore these questions by going back to the sources, encountering the voices of historical actors in original documents.
There's usually some kind of an intro lecture or, giving students the background information, setting the stage for what they might not know. And then typically it poses the question for the day. Is the question for the day, was the New Deal a success? Is the question for the day, was Lincoln a racist?
Is the image of the happy 1950s housewife accurate? I want you to show me the evidence that leads you to believe that's your answer.
Happy, look, they said they're bored.
Like where?
Document C.
I've never really done that before, like getting the chance to agree and disagree with what we study. It helps you get deeper in what you're learning about.
We have a crucial problem of literacy in our nation's urban schools. And the moment this approach goes into a school, what we automatically do is we double the amount of time that kids are exposed to text.
I believe that their reading is improving at least as much as their ability to analyze documents. I think this constant knowing when you walk in the door, we are reading today, and we are not just putting our eyes on the page and hoping that the bell rings before anybody asks us a question, but we're reading and then we're talking about it.
96% in document D of women married reported that they were either extremely happy or fairly happy.
We have document A. What's the first thing we're going to do?
Sort! Teachers trained in the approach were matched with teachers in regular history classrooms. At the end of the year, students were assessed on their historical thinking ability, their mastery of factual knowledge, and their growth in general reading comprehension.
What we found was that not only did students in the treatment classes and the Reading Like Historian classes do better on historical thinking and on the retention of historical facts, but also they grew in reading comprehension.
So I know history like boom, boom, boom like this now. It's kind of easier, and I know certain dates kind of weird and everything, but I know certain days like better now.
I was absolutely into nurturing them so that they would never be made to feel badly because they didn't have good reading skills, and I took very good care of them, and I didn't teach them how to read anything. Now that I see that there's a difference between making somebody feel better about themselves for no good reason and giving them the skills to be able to do better in their lives and be more powerful in their own lives, right? That's what I think this program has done for me as a teacher, because I'm able to see them actually do so much better.
I read more thoroughly and more like detailed to certain parts. I look for certain things right away.
Yeah, so far this is my favorite history class. Like, I really mean it. It's not boring, it's fun. I learned many things. I wish there was like a better, like for next year, for senior year, like a same history class, but we're learning more things. Because I feel like there's more to learn, a lot more.
Thank you very much. Again, some people have seen the video and some people haven't. Take a look at it at your time, but I am here for you at least for the next 7 minutes to answer your questions about our approach.
I was noticing when I was on the YouTube video that there were quite a few additional videos produced by the Stanford History Education Group. Do you want to describe what some of those are? Because I have a feeling this group may be particularly interested in them.
Sure. We have quite a few videos of, if you go to our main webpage, the sheg.stanford.edu, and Joel Breakstone, if you're going to listen to that webinar as well, will tell you more about how to use different kinds of assessments in the history classroom. But I think my experience in working with groups of teachers who are not familiar with this approach, the most useful thing from our experience has been to see teachers actually teaching in these ways in some very difficult urban settings, in some settings that where students may be in 11th grade but are not reading at grade level. What do you do? And so the teaching channel, teachingchannel.org, has produced a 50-minute special in various classrooms that are using our reading like a historian approach. And if you go to the History Channel and register, it's completely, the registration is free. You will see a series of about 5 or 6 videotapes that together come to about 50 minutes of footage of different teachers in different kinds of classrooms using this approach with real students in high school and middle school classrooms. So you'll want to check that out on the teachingchannel.org. Just type in for the search, reading like a historian. There was a question here, is the Stanford History Education Group continuing to come out with lesson plans? The answer is absolutely yes. We are expanding our resources, particularly for the teaching of middle school world history and ancient civilizations, as well as the high school world history curriculum. And we are continuing, again, within our capacity to produce new materials, to be responsive to the needs that you express. We depend upon you. We hope you will follow us. We hope you will write to us. We hope you will use our materials. All of our materials are free. It costs nothing to download. There is no curriculum to buy. All of the materials that we have on our website are completely free. All you have to do is register, and you can download to your heart's delight. There's a question of, could you recommend resources to assist elementary school teachers? Well, I would say one thing to do is to follow Leanne Potter's column in Social Education every month that it comes out, to become a member of the National Council for the Social Studies. There are a variety of good resources for the elementary social studies curriculum. There's a website called Bringing History Home, done at the University of Iowa, which is extraordinary in terms of helping 4th and 5th graders think, both to develop their literacy skills as well as to develop their historical thinking skills. There's a question, do you find it hard to get kids reading? Yes, increasingly it is hard to get kids to read. It's one of the reasons why our primary sources are extremely short. To give an 8th grader or even an 11th grader reading at a normal grade level a dense page of tightly packed text in 10-point type is intimidating. I can tell you that it's intimidating for the students I teach as 18-year-olds at Stanford University. The reason that we work with primary sources in the classroom is not to expose students to copious amounts of texts. It's to teach them to read slowly and to really read closely. And the longer and more dense a text is, the more you defeat the purpose of reading carefully and reading closely. So yes, it's difficult, and students don't spontaneously come to us knowing how to read this way. The best and most important piece of curriculum that you have at your disposal is your own self, and modeling for students how you think about text and how you read this way. Without a clear adult model of how you read, you can bet that many students will not develop the kind of reading skills that you want them to develop in order to be sophisticated, informed citizens.
Thank you, Sam. This is Kathy. I'm going to leave you with Tim's question as the last question of the evening, and Amber sent in a more complex question, and we'll make sure that we get that to you in the chat. You can follow Sam at Sam Weinberg, and his website for the Stanford History Education Group is up on the slide. I'm going to leave you with the last question, then I'm going to advance to the last slide, which is some information about getting a certificate of completion, plus a link to a 3-question survey that we'd like to ask our folks to fill out before they leave. We do have to end the session in about 2 minutes, but Tim's question is, how long does it typically take to get kids up to speed and comfortable with these types of sources?
That's a really good question, Tim. It takes a while because we've done a number on kids, right? We have tested them to death. We've tested them with Traxoline-like tests. And so the consequences of our own fruits is the attitude that many students display, which is, well, just tell me the answer. And so for students to unlearn that is not a 1 or 2 lesson issue. It is something that we have to stay the course and do regularly, and we have to show them how applicable it is to their everyday life. I hope you will see the connections between the kinds of questions that we're asking about historical evidence and the very way that information comes to us in a digital age. If we do not ask, who made a website? Who is telling us this information? Why are they telling it to us? Is it sponsored? Is it sponsored content, which is a euphemism for an ad that actually masquerades as a news story? These kinds of questions might have been in a previous age something that maybe only the elite students had to think about. In the digital age that we live, where all information comes to us, where there are no people who are vetting what comes to us on the web, as we saw from the example of the textbook, Our Virginia, these are the kinds of ways of thinking and the ways of knowing that have to be the inheritance, that have to be in the possession of every single informed citizen that we want to send out to the world in our classrooms. So I think my time is actually up. Thank you very much, and be sure to contact us. Take care. I've really enjoyed your questions.
Thank you very much, Sam. This has been a very enriching session for all of us. I thank you for your time, and I thank you all for your attendance. I will make sure that this chat gets to Sam Weinberg so that he can take a look at your in-depth questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to end the recording and end the meeting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.